Apollonius of Tyana, the original Jesus? So, if you need a short answer, I'm ready to give it right now. And the answer is no. Apollonius was not the original Jesus, but he was linked to Jesus for centuries, mostly because the Western world was absolutely crazy about Christianity, and even atheists were seeing Jesus everywhere. In Apollonius, in any philosopher with a beard, in the clouds, in the trees. If you grow up in a society with one dominating religious system, be it Christianity, Islam, or communism, it will always be an important part of your life. Probably even disproportionately important part of your life, even if you don't agree with this system. Everybody knows this piece of Christian narrative that there were numerous messianic figures and charismatic cult leaders roaming the Middle Eastern region in the time when Jesus was supposedly born. Well, not only the Middle East, but also the whole ancient Mediterranean. These teachers of wisdom were so numerous that, yeah, they were a part of the scenery, which kind of proves that Jesus Christ definitely, at the very least, had a prototype, and therefore he's kind of historical or whatever. So that's where Apollonius pops up, and people seriously start drawing parallels between him and Jesus. They've been doing this for centuries. And that's all very interesting. But if these messianic figures were so ubiquitous, please name at least 10 of them. Or, I don't know, 5. And not the fictional characters from the Bible like John the Baptist. And please exclude ancient cynics and people like Dio Chrysostom. He was not a messianic figure. He was basically a cynic as well. In the end, this piece of narrative kind of falls apart, but the idea is still there. And the figure of Apollonius indeed becomes practically the one and only thing that reinforces this absurd theory. And probably that's what draws the attention of the scholars. That is why Apollonius is studied as a prototype of Jesus, even by some Christians. Because, there is a certain material that says that there was once this wandering Pythagorean philosopher who was very wise and could perform magic tricks. Okay, so who was Apollonius of Tyana, or Tiana? The letter is closer to the original pronunciation of the Greek city in Cappadocia. Okay, who was Apollonius of Tyana, Tiana, and what sources do we have? Well, there's only one source that tells us the details of his life. And these details are mostly fantastic. Most probably we're dealing with more or less a work of fiction. It is called the Life of Apollonius of Tyana, and it was written by Flavius Philostratus, and it is attributed to the early 3rd century, more than a century after Apollonius had died, or was taken to the heavens alive, like, I don't know, Romulus. This is one of their versions, very believable. Everything else is just references here and there from a later period. They are relatively numerous, but we can't be absolutely sure what sources they use. Maybe they mostly use Flavius Philostratus, if Flavius Philostratus is authentic at all. There's also a short fragment of the work attributed to Apollonius on sacrifices, preserved in Christian sources. There are letters of Apollonius, but the majority of these letters was probably composed by Flavius Philostratus. When we're talking about these references, we should be precise to get the whole picture. So let's go through these references. It is important and it tells us some interesting things. First, Apollonius is mentioned by Cassius Dio, who lived, if you believe him, at the time of Philostratus, which is the Severan dynasty. Dio's Roman history is a very important text, unlike weird Christian secondary sources. I will give you the exact quotes from this work. There are only two of them. A certain Apollonius of Tyana, on that very day and at that very hour when Domitian was being murdered, as was afterwards accurately determined by events that happened in both places, mounted a lofty rock at Ephesus, or possibly it was somewhere else, and having called together the populace, uttered these words: "Good Stephanos, bravo Stephanos, smite the bloodthirsty wretch! You have struck, you have wounded, you have slain." This is what actually happened, though one should doubt it 10,000 times over. And now the second quote. His, Caracallas, delight in magicians and jugglers was so great that he commended and honored Apollonius of Cappadocia, who had flourished under Domitian and was a thorough juggler and magician, and erected a shrine to him. That's about it. So when I say references and mentioned in the text, sometimes I mean it quite literally. You cannot extract much information on Apollonius here, except for that he was from Tiana, was quite alive during the reign of Domitian, and more than a century later, Caracalla was a big fan. This anecdote about Apollonius and the murder of Domitian is also present in Philostratus, so we take a note. Now, the next reference comes from Porphyry, and this is the second half of the 3rd century, so the situation with the sources becomes really bad. And the works that are attributed to Porphyry are occasionally quite questionable. Porphyry was a prominent Neoplatonist philosopher, and his main achievement was, and still is, that he recorded and compiled the works of his teacher, Plotinus. It is called the Enneads, and it is a huge monumental work, or a collection of works. So, about a century after Philostratus, if the attribution is correct, Porphyry mentions Apollonius in his book Against the Christians, where he, as you might guess, criticizes Christianity and kind of engages in polemics with Christians. The problem here, and in many ways it is a typical situation, the problem is that this book doesn't exist. No copies survived. But, basically no copies of anything from this period survived, which includes Cassius Dio and Philostratus as well. But it is believed that their works were copied, and through this process, the information came down to us. This is obviously a problem in itself, as I've mentioned many times before. And this is one of the main reasons for extreme source criticism to exist, which occasionally becomes ugly. Even uglier than the lack of critical approach to the sources. But okay, the situation of Porphyry and his Against the Christians is somewhat different, because it is said that all of the copies of the book were not just lost or disintegrated because of old age, but they were simply destroyed in the first half of the 5th century, like all of them. Because Christianity under Theodosius II, Theodosius the Younger, became a full-blown totalitarian ideology which started persecuting non-Christians and wiping out the information that didn't fit into their narrative. That's one of the ways to interpret what what was happening, if it was happening, since the sources are bad. But take a look at the Code of Theodosius, and yeah, it all looks a bit grim. So this book of Porphyry was lost, but parts of it are reconstructed from the fragments copied by Christians. Because, they had a debate with Porphyry and were aggressively debunking him. That's how these fragments survived. And one of the fragments mentions Apollonius, who, in his opinion, performed miracles as good as Jesus, if not better. So this is one more reference, a reference in a secondary source, a contaminated source. If you apply source criticism here, well, we're dealing essentially not with an anti-Christian text, but with a Christian text. The situation is comparable with Celsus, who is sometimes declared a brilliant anti-Christian thinker from the 2nd century and very much beloved by radical atheists. But the problem here is that his work is also partially reconstructed from the quotes in Christian texts, and we can't be entirely sure that the text is authentic or that the author actually ever existed. Another reference, theoretically, could be found in Socianus Hierocles, who lived in the times of Diocletian, who produced a work called The Lover of Truth, which, as you might expect by now, doesn't really exist. There is a work attributed to our favorite Christian author Eusebius called Against Hierocles, and that's how we know about The Lover of Truth. Eusebius, or Pseudo-Eusebius, spends quite a bit of time discussing how Apollonius, in fact, was a godless wizard. There are other small pieces where Apollonius is mentioned, like Lactantius, or the Anthology of Stabius, or the Byzantine Encyclopedia Suda. There is also a small anecdote which mentioned Apollonius in the best historical book of all time, Historia Augusta. So essentially all the references, apart from Cassius Dio, come from a later period, and with the exception of the anecdote from Historia Augusta, everything else is more or less just Christian sources, which is an established politically correct term for the highly unreliable religious works written by God knows who and God knows when, and attributed to a certain period by people who were essentially sympathetic to the idea of killing everybody who doesn't accept Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior. As I've said, the majority of information on Apollonius we have on our hands, the majority of information you'll ever hear about him anywhere, comes from Flavius Philostratus and his book. Everything else is mostly quite uninformative references. But they exist, which might make you think that indeed Apollonius is not a purely fictional character, but a historical figure who became a legend after some time. Now, The Life of Apollonius of Tyana by Flavius Philostratus. This book is quite sizable. That doesn't mean you can derive lots of valuable information from it. In fact, it doesn't really have much substance. Most of it essentially is essentially a novel about a road trip through exotic locations like India. Occasionally, it is quite poetic, quite amusing, and quite interesting. But most of the time, it is quite boring. Although it is a personal opinion and tastes might differ. Later, this book becomes a little bit like Forrest Gump, when every now and then our character meets people of importance from the 1st century, including the presidents of the United States of Rome. Apollonius is obviously much smarter than Forrest Gump, but also prone to running from one part of the country to another for no particular reason. So yeah, it is an ancient novel, or maybe not that ancient. It kind of depends on when it first reappeared and when it was first published. That's a different subject. The work is attributed to the early 3rd century, but once again, it is an attribution based on what the author tells us, and we don't know how reliable he is. So Flavius Philostratus starts his book by telling us that he collected information from various sources, none of which survived, and he is doing this because he's been commissioned by Julia Domna, the wife of Septimius Severus, our favorite Black Emperor of Rome. So this is where we get the date. And it is believed that the work was finished after the death of Julia Domna. What we learn from the book is that Apollonius was a Pythagorean philosopher. And he explicitly says in one of the quite poetic passages in this novel that he's planning to live the life of Pythagoras. He even wrote a biography of his favorite philosopher, but obviously it's gone. Apollonius came from a quite wealthy family, but at a certain point decided to essentially live something that suspiciously looks like a lifestyle of a cynic. And some of his quotes are actually quite in line with the philosophy of cynicism and obviously Stoicism. I'll give you an example because it is a nice and very Stoic quote. "He who is destined to become a carpenter will become one even if his hands have been cut off. And he who has been destined to carry off the prize for running in the Olympic Games will not fail to win even if he broke his leg." Like a good Pythagorean, Apollonius was a vegetarian, and more importantly, always insisted that all of the sacrifices to the gods should never include any bloodshed. No slaying of cattle or something like that. He also possessed a number of superhuman abilities, which included prescience. He could foretell future events and sometimes see the event that was happening right at this moment somewhere far away, like in this anecdote about the assassination of Domitian. He also allegedly spoke all of the human languages. And once he vanished right during the court hearing in Rome and teleported himself to another location. He knew how to fight evil spirits, and there's a couple of interesting stories about that. Like the story about Lamia and the story about lifting the curse from the city of Ephesus. All of these stories about miracles and superhuman abilities are obviously very reliable. That's exactly how it all happened. Apollonius, as you might expect, was very wise, and he traveled a lot, mostly with his companion/student Demas. So he met a lot of other wise people, and they exchanged knowledge to a degree. He went to India, and he was very impressed by local sages. He was all over the Asia Minor. He went to Egypt and further down to the land of Ethiopians. He's been visiting Rome every now and then, starting with the reign of Nero. In one way or another, he communicated with the emperors and was on friendly terms with Vespasian and Titus. Not on very friendly terms with Domitian, who tried to persecute him, mostly for wizardry and alleged connections with Nerva, which is a bit weird. He communicated with Nerva as well, and probably died during the reign of Nerva. Although we don't know where exactly, and Philostratus gives a number of versions. We also don't know if he ever died at all. Maybe he just went straight to, I don't know, celestial spheres. He met a couple of actual well-known philosophers along the way, which includes Musonius Rufus, a Stoic philosopher, and the teacher of Epictetus, and a Cynic philosopher, Demetrius, a friend and companion of Seneca. All in all, these events fit quite well with the narrative of Cassius Dio, even suspiciously well. That's pretty much it if you don't go into the details and don't try to retell the whole book of Philostratus for some reason. As you can see, the story of Apollonius is more or less amusing, and probably it makes some sense to actually read Philostratus if you're really interested in the subject, as a monument of Greco-Roman literature, probably, if it is authentic. But when we are trying to speculate about this link between Apollonius and Jesus, it looks very questionable. Unless you have a very strange, but understandable, fixation on Christianity and you have imagination. Apollonius performed miracles, and Jesus performed miracles. Well, okay, so what? Diogenes masturbated in public. If you masturbate in public, it doesn't make you a cynic philosopher, or a philosopher in general. You can find other links, but honestly, Apollonius doesn't strike me as a prototype of Jesus at all. It is a theory. It is okay that this theory exists. It might even be true, but that's unlikely. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notifications. And see you soon.